The House Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation will come to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Representative Curry.
Here.
Representative Morgan. Representative Stucklove.
Here.
Representative Hood.
Present.
Representative Skaggs.
Present. Sorry, Thomas is looking at me.
Can't do that.
I am also here.
Representative Stiegel. Representative Morton.
Here.
Sir, you have 4 of 7 members. You have a quorum and a ghost member somewhere, but you have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Representative Borton moves to approve the minutes from the Transportation Subcommittee meeting last week on February 28th. Without objection, those minutes are approved. All right, great. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to have some more riveting conversations this week on our topics of finding additional revenue options, also kind of exploring ways that we can work on the expense side of the formula as well. We had a pretty robust conversation and presentation from MITA last week, and so we have 2 more presenters this week. First up will be Ron Davis with the HNTB, who will be presenting, I think, more specific on a tolling study. So Ron, if you are here, great. We'll go ahead. The floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chairman Perry and committee, thanks for having me to testify here today. My name is Ram Davis, and I'm a professional engineer and project manager with HNTB, and I served as the deputy project manager on the tolling study, which I'll be speaking about here today. I've been working in tolling and transportation funding for 15 years and live in Fowler, Michigan with my family, and I'm locally based out of HNTB's East Lansing, Michigan office. HNTB is a national employee-owned transportation infrastructure company. We have 240 employees in Michigan across 5 offices and provide consultant services in many different transportation markets, including in tolling around the country. HNTB led the consultant team that performed the Michigan tolling study on behalf of the Michigan Department of Transportation. The MDOT side project manager for the tolling study, Carrie Martin, I know is here today, and she testified briefly last week to provide an introduction to the study for all of you. Today I'm following up with some more details on the study and answering any questions you may have. And I'll start by just mentioning the law that required the study. It was passed in July of 2020. This slide here shows some of the requirements of the study, and also on your handout that you have with the slides. One key thing was 2 steps to the process. Step 1 was a feasibility analysis, and then step 2 was called a strategic implementation plan, so more details on how tolling could be implemented in Michigan. The study wrapped up in late 2022, and the reports were released publicly in January of 2023. There's a website still live on the study called mytollingstudy.com. There you'll find the reports, appendices, some frequently asked questions, and then there's also a public comment forum that's also still open if anyone wants to submit any comments on the study. One of the things that we've tried to work on in our outreach, which I'll talk more about later on the study, but talking about tolling in context of other transportation funding options, and nothing new here. I know Lance from MITA, Benonimi from MITA last week talked a lot about these different options and offered MITA's take on where we should move forward. So we've also been trying to talk about all these different options, the trade-offs and challenges to implementation, including in tolling. One of the things, the relative burden on different vehicle classes is important with tolling, very important to consider. Also, user fees versus non-user fees is something that comes up quite a bit. Tolling is definitely a user fee among those two. One of the things we've talked about with our outreach groups is Act 51 impacts. Tolling would be on the highway system specifically, so the revenue would be on some of those most traveled roads around the state. So thinking about the less traveled roads and how those would be funded and the wider funding needs and picture would be important when we consider tolling. You'll see on this table mileage-based user fees, also called road usage charges. That often comes up with tolling as well. I know Baruch Fiegenbaum from Reason Foundation will be testifying after me today to talk more about that category. But we did hear that a lot. What's the difference between road usage charging and tolling? And how we like to explain it is tolling on the highways, as this study laid out, would be road usage charging on the highway system using today's tolling technology, so more on a subset of roads. Carrie Martin from MDOT did show this slide last week when she testified. That's kind of the bottom line findings. Talks about the toll rate we assumed, 6 to 6.5 cents a mile. That was in 2020 dollars, using transponder payment, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, for passenger cars. And that was found to cover all life cycle costs on about a 545-mile toll system in Michigan, at or above standard performance measures. We found that tolling could diversify revenue sources for transportation and also free up existing sources of funding for other uses, but would certainly require a careful approach to implementation. A common question that we got in our outreach is this even legal? Is it legal to toll existing roads, and would we have to pay back federal funds? There are 4 federal programs shown here that we looked at in context of the study for their reasonableness for tolling, and these were a key part of the strategic implementation plan part of the study. So yes, we can toll, and we did have some initial discussions with Federal Highway related to these programs and their viability, but this is something we would want to continue to discuss closely with the feds moving forward. So yes, it is possible, but there are specific requirements under these programs that we would have to make sure we adhered to. A really important thing is what is tolling and what does it look like from the technology side. Here we're talking about all electronic tolling at highway speeds, so definitely not stop and go cash toll booths. And this is different even than last time we talked about tolling in Michigan. There was a study in 2010 in that time frame, and at that point we still did have some cash toll booths in the assumptions for that. Now any new modern tolling system that comes in around the country is going to have high speed all electronic tolling, kind of as shown in these graphics here on this slide. So how do you pay in that system? I suspect many of you may be familiar with this from traveling in other states. We see that quite often, but the most common way is through a transponder account. So you set up an account and then you get a little device you put in your car. I actually pulled mine off my windshield. I still have mine from when I lived in Illinois several years ago that I use when I travel out of state, but some of the facilities in Michigan already have transponders. Here shown is Mackinac Bridge. They have a sticker type transponder that you can put on your car and pay electronically. There you still have to slow down and pay with the system they have at the toll booths, but you can still pay electronically on the Mackinac Bridge. If you don't have a transponder on these all electronic systems, you get an invoice in the mail. An example is shown here. And typically these toll rates are a little higher to cover the higher administrative costs of collection, but you get them regularly in the mail after you travel on the system. I mentioned the Mackinac Bridge, so we do have tolling in Michigan already on bridges and tunnels, a lot of them at the border, but no toll roads right now. This is another thing we've been talking about when we outreach. This is a different approach than a lot of the other country. We do see a handful of cases where you have existing facilities where you add tolls on them around the country, some bridges, a few roads, including one in Illinois. But right now, the bulk of tolling around the country is when you open a new facility and then toll it initially. Now, much of the system in adjacent states around Michigan was tolled when it initially opened, and a lot of that was in the 1950s, early 1960s. But a lot of states are studying this now, adding tolls to existing roads because of growing funding challenges. For example, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut have all had very detailed and rigorous studies similar to Michigan in the last few years. So the legislation here required us to look at all existing highways in Michigan, as shown here. It's about 1,900 centerline miles. And we looked at those and applied various screening criteria, quantitative and qualitative, different analytical approaches to consider the viability for tolling. I mentioned the 2 steps of the study. Step 1 was that feasibility analysis, and the results of the feasibility analysis are shown on this slide here. The color coding denotes different tiering of the system. With one of our key assumptions, we did determine that you couldn't flip a switch and turn on tolling across the whole state at one point. One of the key assumptions, which we'll talk more about later, is you want to do some work on the system before you start tolling it to show the driver benefit. So on this slide here, we show the tiering, how you'd gradually roll it out on the system, and some of the other characteristics that we considered in the feasibility analysis. From there, we did more detailed study, which is the key, which I'll focus on in the rest of this presentation, in a strategic implementation plan. So how could you start in kind of that initial wave of tolling? This graphic here shows what roads we focused on in that strategic implementation plan and what federal programs we assumed for these different roads to allow tolling from the federal standpoint. Also denotes on I-94, we did assume some operational improvements on different sections of the highway to address safety and operational concerns on I-94 as well. So I'll focus a little bit on the money side of this, the costs and the revenues on that 545-mile system. On the cost side, key assumption is in the green box here on this graphic. So one of the assumptions we made, we'd use toll bond financing against the future revenue projections to allow you to do that work initially before you start tolling, which is pretty typical on other tolling systems as they start off initially. You'd take bonds against that future revenue and then use the proceeds to fund that initial work. So that's a key thing here. And that initial capital program to start the tolling on the 545-mile system would be about $8.5 billion was our estimate. And that was between roughly 2026 and 2031, that investment there. This would, in addition to improving all roads and bridges to meet or exceed performance standards, also some operational improvements, and then obviously installing the toll system would be included in that cost. Beyond that, you'd continue to invest in the system as needed, and it would continue to be self-supporting. One of the things that really wanted to focus on, and we see in other toll facilities around the country, would be investment in maintenance and operations is enhanced on a toll system. When you're paying a toll as a driver, you do expect a better user experience. So more aggressive snow plowing, for example, routine maintenance, incident response, mowing, things like that would be enhanced in a toll facility, which was included in our analysis. On the revenue side, so here, you again would sell toll bonds, do the work under the model we're talking about here, and then add tolling. Initial tolling wave on this 545-mile system was assumed to be in 2028, and then the entire 545-mile system would be tolled beginning in 2032. That's that phase implementation over a 4-year period. Toll rate assumptions shown here, already mentioned those. For large commercial trucks, the toll rates were assumed to be 4 times higher, which is pretty typical looking around the country at the tolls for different user classes on toll facilities. We estimated that $1.3 billion in revenue annually could be collected starting in 2032 on this 545 miles. And the graphic on the right just shows how that compares with the current state level revenues in the budget for this year. So that's pretty similar to what we collect now in each of the motor fuel and registration fee categories, that amount of funding. Cost of collection is an important thing that we track, and this often comes up in discussion of opponents for tolling. We did estimate 13% of gross toll revenue would be going towards the cost of collection in various ways, which is higher certainly than the gas tax right now. That's a very efficient mechanism to collect revenue, but that's something to consider when you consider the variety of options we have at hand. This slide kind of brings together the costs and revenues into a consistent graphic. The one on the left here, the dashed black line would be your gross toll revenue per year, and then underneath it, there's stacked bar charts just showing how the different costs line up. We did include a tolling discount mitigation and benefits program, which I can talk more about if you have any questions on that. That came out of our outreach and a lot of questions about equity and things like that, so we did build that into the financial model here. Debt service would be important to pay back those additional bonds. And then renewal and replacement costs for roadway, bridge, and toll systems are in the yellow. And here you can see some years those are above the toll revenue, some years below, so you'd want to set up a reserve fund to save excess toll revenues in years where there's more and use that to pay in years where there's more needs. And that was based on some engineering analysis. We did look at the roads and bridges included in the system and where they were in their life cycle now. When do they need the work? Is it in another 10 to 20 years, 30 years down the line, or do they need it right now? And then doing that work when the facilities needed it most. So this did, confirm the financially viable, self-supporting toll system, which is something we wanted to focus on in this study. Other toll facilities around the country, there's some that are not fully self-supporting. Some do get funding from other sources, but in this study, we did focus on a sole funded by tolls type system. Just mention a couple other things. I mentioned the outreach. We did some pretty robust outreach to specific groups. We didn't do any general public meetings here, but we really targeted specific groups to learn about their concerns and their questions about tolling, and those are listed here. Some examples of that, various civic groups. We met with over 20 organizations overall, tourism groups, different chambers of commerce, things like that. The trucking industry, we had several meetings with them. They're commonly an opponent of tolling, so we wanted to make sure to hear their concerns. And you see a lot of the questions we got here. Funding, obviously, discount program questions, equity, traffic type questions. And then similarly, we had quite a bit of legislative feedback as well in outreach there. I know many of these folks are no longer in office, but I see some familiar names here that are still in office. So we heard many similar things to the more general outreach group, funding, toll technology, traffic impacts, and things like that. One of the characterizations that we commonly heard with a lot of different groups, and it was with some of them it was a little surprising, something along the lines of, in the past, I would immediately dismiss tolling if I heard about it in Michigan, but after hearing this, I'm more likely to consider it as an option, with, I would say, the notable exception of the trucking industry, which is still very much opposed to tolling, which I can get into in more detail if you have any questions there. So in addition to the financial revenue side of it, I'd say in-state versus out-of-state was a common question, diversions, equity, and technology. And I do have some more information on any of those themes if you have questions there. I'll wrap up with toll implementation timeline here. This would have been released in our study a little over a year ago. And that considered if you did want to move forward with tolling and kind of the go-ahead would be early in 2023. So we probably want to reanalyze this a little bit if we did decide to move forward in 2024. But in general, what we were looking at last year was, starting some of the construction work in 2026 here, and then starting tolling on the initial segment in 2028. You can see many of the other milestones that you would want to address leading up to that in this graphic, including a couple phases of legislation, setting up a discount mitigation and benefit advisory board, environmental reviews, and things like that. And I'll close my formal notes here with just, I'm often asked by industry peers, family and friends, if I think we should add tolls, just given my role in the study. And I'll often start by saying, we want to make sure we don't consider this in a vacuum. There's a lot of other transportation needs and options out there, so we do want to consider them with those. But I do say it's very compelling when you look at some of our most valuable road and bridge assets and how we're going to address those needs. The potential to set up that dedicated funding stream for them is quite compelling. And especially when you see successful toll roads in neighboring states to Michigan and those toll bridges in Michigan. For example, the Mackinac Bridge was originally funded and set up in this way, and the toll revenue there goes to the ongoing maintenance of that facility. So I think it is quite compelling. But I do appreciate the opportunity for these remarks, and I'll open it up to any questions now.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. With that, I have a couple questions before we open it up. Just as that last slide, the toll implementation, the Gantt chart that you had, I guess not to split hairs, but this was as of January 2023. Where are we on this chart right now?
This was assuming we would have kind of a push to move ahead, I'd say early last year.
Okay.
So I'd say you probably want to shift this back maybe 8 months to a year
Okay.
from what's shown.
Okay, yeah, just to...
Yep.
All right, so if we kind of got our act together and all rallied around the concept of tolling, we would begin tolling at the earliest in 2029-ish?
Yeah, that would be my best guess based
Okay.
on this. Yep.
I think you touched on it a little bit, but this is a heavy CapEx endeavor in terms of just implementing all the infrastructure that you would need. The number there was like an $8 billion number, I think, in the presentation. Would all of that be bonded out, or would there be any liability to the state and any money that we would have to put up front to get this rolling?
I think we did, and I think this is in the report. I could double check, but I think we did we did assume some, I think it was in the range of 25 to 30 million upfront type work to get things started. And some of the initiatives here get them started before the financing closes. But beyond that, all of the road work and things like that would be self-supported by the toll system once it gets going.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you for that. And I guess I just had more of a philosophical question, more maybe qualitative, but I can imagine that the concept of tolling is not super popular with some people, just the sheer reality of having to pay more money out of their pocket to use roads. Do you have any metrics or data in terms of just how well this is received by Michiganders, ideally kind of spliced out by urban, suburban, and rural, and if there's just any variance in terms of people's perception or favorability of tolling?
Yeah, we do see, and I think it depends a lot on how you explain the money's going to be used. The more specific you get, generally how favorable people are does improve. And we did do, I don't know the numbers, remember the numbers off the top of my head, but we did do a little bit of a survey early on in the study, and I could send that over to you to kind of get some of that background from that original survey we did, if that would be helpful too.
Yeah, it would. Thank you. I
Yep.
appreciate that. Great. We'll open it up here. Rep. Steckloff.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being with us today. Just a few questions for clarification. You talked about the cost, $8.5 billion. That includes, it looks like, everything, though. What is the implementation of just the tolling part, to implement tolls? And would that include any additional roads that would need to be created, non-toll, that kind of run the same direction?
So that $8.5 billion included all of the road work on that 545-mile system to bring up the existing assets up to performance measures, anywhere where we're lacking now. So the road improvements, the bridge improvements, all that capital work to bring it up. It did include some what we call operational enhancements or widening, whether it's traditional widening or more shoulder running type things on I-94. But all that money would be on that specific highway system that's already in place in Michigan there.
What would the cost be to implement tolls, to get it all set up?
So the physical infrastructure
Yeah.
itself. I think the best thing I have there would be that 13% roughly and that includes the physical infrastructure, all the back office systems to collect the administrative type staffing costs associated with the tolling agency itself and all those operations.
If we were to do this tomorrow,
Yeah.
and we were appropriate it, just to get the toll set up, do you know what that cost would be?
I could get back with you with
Okay.
that number. Are you looking for just the physical infrastructure?
Physical infrastructure.
Okay.
And if it would have to
Break it out.
include any additional roads that might be needed to create, I don't think it would.
No, I don't think you'd need
And then the next question is, do you know how much revenue would be collected if we were to stay out of the urban core? Where if we were just to focus on, I think 94 would be one of the biggest ones since it does go to the international bridges. If we were to just do maybe 94 and 75, it'd stay out of, 696 and all of those urban areas. Do you have an idea of what those two would bring in?
I know it would still bring in substantial revenue because 94 especially is one of the heaviest traveled highways in the state, if not the heaviest. So I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it would still be a very robust system. And that did actually come up a lot in outreach. I'd say people would kind of say, well, does this make sense? They would often bring up 94 as a logical starting point. And I guess ironically, too, Michigan was looking at I-94. What became I-94 is a toll road in the 50s. They had a toll agency set up and even hosted tolling meetings in the state with other national toll agencies because it is a corridor kind of running parallel to those toll roads in Ohio and Indiana.
Yeah, what if we were to make it 1 cent cheaper than 80/90?
Yeah, I mean, that is the case because I venture now that some especially multi-state freight traffic does travel on 94 instead of those toll roads in Ohio and Indiana.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Representative Steele.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. So I just want to refer back to slide number 20, and then I have a question, then I have a comment based on the answer. But Are you saying that between the operation, which is the red bar, and the blue bar, which is the actual debt service, rolls close to about $1 billion between the combination of the two of them, just to start off? And as we proceed forward, it goes up to about $3 billion-ish, or
those
two and a
two-
half?
Yeah, it looks like, yeah, probably closer to 2. But yeah, I see it does get over 2 in some of those later years. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so that's my question to you, and you weren't here for our last week's presentation, but there was, Lance gave us a presentation to share with us that we're about $3 billion short on our funding for our roads on an annual basis. And so I'm just opening this up for the committee and for whoever's watching this, that if we're short $3 billion, if we just invested the $3 billion instead of getting into another system, which would be toll roads of $3 billion, I think that we would be better off just taking $3 billion and investing it into the roads without going into toll roads. And I'm just looking at it as a driver, and I'm looking at it as a husband that drove I-75 for 30 years, that has paid into the road system for the last 30 years between their gas tax and their federal tax and their property taxes and all the taxes that go into it. And as a driver, to go to work to pay the taxes into the system and still not have viable roads that are functioning, and we have a $3.3 billion worth of debt and we're paying interest into the system that we have already paid into, it's almost like rubbing in your face, no offense to you, that now for the last 10 years of your work life, as my husband, and he goes into retirement, now you will have to pay a toll to go to work every single day, even though you paid into the system the last 30 years. I find that not very nice, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So I'm not necessarily in favor. I would rather spend the $3 billion instead of a new system into our current system without having to bring something else to the table. That's my comment.
Yeah, I could mention a couple things on that, and I do agree that tolling would require people to pay more than they do now, and I think that's something that we would have to continue to discuss closely if we did decide to move forward with this. I will mention the debt service, the blue part of this graphic, that would go towards that initial capital program and paying that off. So that is, it actually does go into investment on the road there initially, that $8.5 billion, which the largest portion of that is to that renewal of the infrastructure there, that initial renewal. And then the red line here, there is administrative operations costs, but all that does include a lot of routine work that happens now on the road anyway. So the routine maintenance and administration and things like that. But I do understand your concern there too on the fundamental concern you have on the costs, and I think that would need to continue to be discussed.
Just to follow up, we wouldn't necessarily have to do all those improvements if it wasn't a toll, though. These are additional improvements that we have to abide by because it now has become a toll road. Is that?
Yeah.
You
I
might
think
not have
that
to
is-
do some of those improvements.
That is true, yeah.
Okay.
I think when you do pay a toll, users do expect an enhanced level of service on a toll facility so that, smoother road conditions and better snow removal and things like that is typical on a toll facility. Yep.
Thank you.
Rep. Borton.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Ron, for your presentation today. I appreciate that. It's obvious we need to look at all options for funding our roads going forward. There's no doubt in anybody's mind as far as that goes. And I'm certainly not against toll roads at all. I'm a little concerned about how effective they would be in Michigan. I've recently traveled the toll roads in Illinois and Oklahoma, and I found them very easy didn't have to stop, drove through. They sent me a bill in the mail. It was very inexpensive, and I got to drive on a lot of great roads. But I noticed that a lot of the plates on those roads were not from those states. So they were people passing through like myself. And I'm wondering, we're familiar, Michigan is not exactly a place that you pass through. If you come here, you're coming here to stay. Have you taken a look at what percentage of funds we would be collecting from out-of-state people? Because it looks to me like if we put these toll roads where they're being suggested, it's going to be in the backs of our residents here in Michigan, and we won't be really collecting that much from people just passing through.
Yeah, it's a great point, and that came up a lot in our outreach too, that type of question and concern. I do have kind of an appendix slide that shows some of those statistics that I'll bring up here. This one here. So this is slide number 30 if you want to go to that in your packet. But we did look, this is just for passenger cars, so it's a little different for freight traffic, freight traffic is a big portion of revenue on a toll facility. They do pay higher toll rates because of a variety of reasons, which is typical around the industry. So that is one portion, and there's obviously a substantial amount of freight that would be out of state. For example, 94 is a major part of the Toronto to Chicago kind of international commerce corridor, so you do get a lot of out-of-state freight there. This graphic is specifically on passenger cars, which I think gets more to your residents of Michigan type question. So we do see a variety of percentages of in-state, out-of-state, and this was all based on some modeling that we did that drilled down and looked at where people were coming from using data. So on I-94 in southwest Michigan, that S1, I-94 S1, that would be the southwesternmost point of I-94. There we actually do see a quite high percentage of out-of-state users there, over 40%, which kind of makes sense. You're right on the border with Indiana. You get a lot of people coming up to vacation in Michigan in that part of the system. But it does go down on much of the rest of the system. So I'd say that the total system average you can see there in the system we looked at was about 10%. So it would be, for the passenger car side of this, quite a substantial amount of Michigan residents would pay into the Michigan-based roads here.
Okay, me being from northern Michigan, I'm concerned about 127, so as long as I see that coming out of the mix, I'll be much more amenable to vote for that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Rep. Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions here. I think to the first one, to Rep. Borton's point here, I think that's a really good point about who's paying for that road usage. I would personally like to see Ohio start paying for our roads after years of driving on their roads and paying on their end. So I'd like to know which stretch gets directly at Ohio paying for our roads. I'm kidding a little bit, but not entirely. I am curious about, are there any issues or challenges with just targeting those couple of roads that you had on the screen before that get at the most out-of-state drivers? I really do feel like Michigan drivers feel like they're paying a lot for our roadways, even though we still need more revenue for it. But I think there's a lot of value if you can still efficiently capture out-of-state drivers driving on our roadways.
Yeah, I know you would have to be careful if, for example, you just put a toll gantry on the border and only charge people from out of state. That would
No, that's not what I'm saying.
be quite concerning on the federal level. But there are some agencies out east that do offer, if you enroll, for example, in an in-state transponder program, you could have reduced tolls compared to, for example, if you had a transponder from out of state. And that's a common way that I think we see on many East Coast toll agencies of kind of getting at that kind of sentiment there. So that would probably be, I think, the best way to look at that, looking at the tolling industry as a whole.
And then one other just very quick question is, if you were to look at a larger array of tolling, did you see anything in your research, would that shift drivers to more local roads where we wouldn't be necessarily contributing more to local roads? Would you see folks not taking the highway anymore and driving on these local roads that wouldn't necessarily be getting more revenue? Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, that's a great question, too, and that also came up quite frequently in our outreach, and which is common even on existing toll roads. If you were to have a toll increase, you would see more drivers choose not to take the road. So certainly if you add tolls to an existing toll-free road, you would have that happen. And that, again, was in some of our modeling work done by CDM Smith, our consultant partner here. Let me find that one. This is what we call diversion in the industry. So this would be once you, in this case, add a toll on the road, what happens to traffic. And this is a very nuanced thing, too. It depends on the availability of alternative routes and a variety of other characteristics. So we saw the system average here at about 10% of diversion after you add tolling. And I think sometimes in our outreach, immediately people say, well, that's terrible. We'll be driving in the peak periods, and now our local roads will be more congested. And maybe they would be to a certain extent, but often we see more of the diversion happen in the off-peak periods where there's more space to accommodate additional traffic and people are making that financial choice. Do I want to pay the toll? Is there alternative routes that are high speed that I could take? So that I would say there's a little bit of nuance there. And then one other thing I'll just mention quickly on that question too. So coming out of our outreach, this is what I mentioned, that tolling discount benefit and mitigation program, we did set aside a small amount of revenue, some of which we think could go into local community transportation mitigations in the top right there. It's a small amount of revenue, but we wanted to include it in the financial analysis. We put it at 1%. And this, we think some of that could be used towards investing in local roads or local initiatives to help offset the impacts of diversion that some communities may be facing.
All right, great. Rep. Skaggs, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I think that Rep. Borton and Rep. Morgan essentially were asking the question that I had, which is, and I guess I'll be more open about it. I think if we can find a way, if we're talking about a mix of possible revenue streams, and some of those revenue streams are only going to hit Michiganders, I think it's very serious that we ought to be thinking about our Tier 1 roads being in places that are most likely to capture people not in that category. That is, what on the west side of the state we call FIPS, and then over here we probably refer to as Ohio people, or some other designation. But I really think that ought to be a focus on these north-south routes, and perhaps on, and then clearly on 94 if that data makes sense. So I'll ask a different question, which is on page, well, whatever, on one of the slides, I think here, probably around 6 or 7. Brownfield tolling approach. Tolling existing roads is not common in the industry. So where do we have some examples of tolling existing roads? And how was that? What was the popular reaction to having to pay for roads that used to be free?
Yeah, that's a great question too. In the Midwest, a couple examples in Illinois, there's a 10 to 15 mile road west of the O'Hare Airport that was previously under IDOT ownership and was transferred to the tollway system there. And they added tolls onto it to do quite a few improvements and then to extend the road. So that's one example in the Chicago area. And, people did continue to pay, and there certainly were people that were opposed to that, but I think that gets to the key part where drivers do expect the benefit of what they're going to be paying on the system. They want to see some improvements. So that's why here we would definitely advocate to do the work before you start the toll, and kind of similar to that case in Illinois. Another good example would be I-65 is a bridge between Indiana and Kentucky in the Louisville area, and that's a major bridge, captures a lot of significant freight travel and passenger travel and some commuters as well, and that was tolled as well. That's probably a little under 10 years ago now, and again there was opposition to that, just like we see elsewhere, but it moved forward and it did get started there because the need is great. So I think that's where it comes down to, I think, showing the benefit to the user through better operations and keeping the road at or above performance measures, and then you can address some other concerns through a variety of ways.
Okay, so those examples are a bridge in 15 miles. So basically, there aren't a lot of examples of taking
that was
significant 500 miles worth of highway system and transitioning to tolls.
Yes,
Okay.
that is definitely the case. Like I said, many states are studying this in light of the challenges we're facing, but this would be a larger scale than elsewhere what we've seen. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Cool. Yeah. Quick follow-up from Rep. Borton.
Yep, very quick. Ryan, as you know, many county road agencies perform the maintenance on the MDOT system. So going forward on these toll roads, who will be picking that up? MDOT, third-party agencies, who's going to handle the maintenance on them?
I think that could be structured in a different way, and it would be up to the toll agency to decide. I'd venture to guess if it's going well now that the toll agency may want to continue with the county, but the agreement and contract would be set up perhaps to do it more aggressively than in the past to account for the increased operational enhancements.
Thank you. All right, Ron, thank you for your presentation on tolling. Spurred a flurry of questions, so thank you, colleagues, for all the questions here. Be respective of time for our next presenter. We're going to be moving on to Baruch Fiegenbaum, Senior Managing Director of Transportation Policy for the Reason Foundation, who will be presenting an overview of road user-based charges, also known as vehicle miles traveled. And so, Baruch, whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much, Representative Perry, for inviting me and other members of the subcommittee. I'm thrilled that you are interested in transportation funding. Obviously, a very important topic that we need to address. My name is Baruch Fiegenbaum. I'm the Senior Managing Director of Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation. At Reason, we've been around for almost 50 years and have advised 6 of the previous 7 presidents on transportation policy. I am on 3 Transportation Research Board committees, in addition to the Mileage-Based User Fee Subcommittee, which is what I'm going to be speaking about today. So, okay. If I know how to work the presentation, it's always a great start. So, an overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about why an alternative revenue source is needed, talk about some of the other highway funding options in addition to mileage-based user fees, talk about some of the concerns, because I think there's going to be some, especially with any new technologies, talk about what a state pilot might actually encompass, talk a little bit about what Michigan DOT and some of the other agencies have already done with mileage-based user fees, and then my thoughts on how I would go ahead and conduct a state pilot. So the fuel tax. So the fuel tax has been, it's actually now not the largest, it's the second largest, but it's historically been one of the largest funding mechanisms for Michigan's highways. And it's been around for 100 years, and we're all used to paying it. We go to the gas pump, and there it is. Seems pretty simple. The problem is, because of the increase in electric vehicles, the increase in hybrid vehicles, and most importantly, the improved fuel efficiency of conventional vehicles, I like to say I got a new vehicle that was similar to my previous one, and it's actually 4 miles per gallon more fuel efficient. And if you think about 4 miles per gallon over the course of 100,000 miles, that's a lot. So I like to say the fuel tax is like a rock star in his farewell tour. He's been around for a while, but, you know, we need to do something here. He's not looking so good. And indeed, in Michigan, the fuel tax has lost 50% of its purchasing power over the last 30 years. And that's the reason we need a new funding source. So what are some different funding options? And some of these Michigan already uses, but I think there are some challenges with them. The general fund, not particularly reliable, not dedicated, has to compete against other priorities in the budget that may be a higher priority for folks. Sales tax, another issue. Obviously, education is important. It can take a higher priority. Economic downturns, there's some consistency issues, there's some problems with bonding against it. Tire taxes, weight distance fee, and I did put in having Ohio pay for it, but I don't think Ohio is going to feel real good about that. Now, if you can make that happen, then okay. That and tolling, and of course Ron mentioned tolling and how it can be feasible for limited access highways, and I personally do think it should be an option where it's fiscally feasible and federal law allows, which is most places. But when you're talking about local streets, it's not realistic, and so we need something that can be implemented on local streets with traffic lights as well. So mileage-based user fees are one promising option. They're also known, by the way, as a road usage charge, as a road charge, as a vehicle miles traveled fee. We haven't in the transportation space figured out exactly what we like, so we just give it a bunch of different names. And I like to say, as I mentioned, it's for all vehicles. It's not just for electric or hybrid vehicles. It's a charge per mile driven. The state rate is typically between 2 and 2.5 cents per mile, depending on, and I'm looking now as a straight replacement for the fuel tax. And heavy-duty trucks would typically pay a higher rate, usually about 4 times, since they wear out the highways more than automobiles. But again, that's a discussion to have. That's just a recommendation. So a bunch of other states have studied mileage-based user fees. There's actually been 2 national commissions that also have looked at them, and more than 30 states now have actually conducted pilots. There have been 2 multi-state coalitions, the Eastern Transportation Coalition, which is on the East Coast, and Rock America, which is on the West Coast, but actually includes the state of Ohio, that have examined pilots. And they've done that to look at some interstate issues in terms of people traveling between different states and sort of how we iron that out. And then the 4 states with the permanent programs now are Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia. So I want to go and talk about the common concerns because these are real. I believe they can be addressed, but I don't want to dismiss them because I think they're significant. And so privacy. So people worry that a mileage-based user fee can be used to monitor the location. And the reality is that GPS technology is a one-way collection device. So by itself, it cannot track the location of a receiver. You'd actually need another technology in order for that to happen. Rural residents, there's a concern that rural residents are going to pay more than with the fuel tax because rural residents tend to drive further. And what we found in other pilots in other states is that rural residents actually pay less because they tend to have a higher share of pickup trucks and older vehicles that are substantially less fuel efficient than the vehicles that more urban residents tend to have and suburban residents have. And so some of these equity issues in terms of them not necessarily being fair to folks have not played out as some folks would think. Double taxation, obviously a concern in my book. We tout MBUFs as a replacement and not a supplement, not in addition to the fuel tax. And in most of the pilots, in fact, in all of the pilots, folks who have paid their fuel tax or folks who have used a mileage-based user fee have had their fuel tax refunded to them. Cost of collection, I will say that initially the mileage-based user fee is a little higher to collect than the fuel tax, which is generally tends to be 2%, but can be as high as 5%. But we found in the pilot states, particularly Virginia, that's decreasing quickly with scale. And I would also note choosing the vendor that you're going to work with in your program is really important because the better deal that you negotiate, obviously the lower collection costs you can get. So one of the questions I get is, well, do we even need to do a state pilot? I mean, wouldn't it just be good if we could go to a permanent program? And on some levels, I can see the attraction of that. But I think it's important to answer the questions about how it would work in Michigan, because every state is different. And just because it's working really well in Virginia, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in Michigan. So what would be the questions? So an example I would give is that in Hawaii, when they did a pilot, they found that rental cars turned out to be a pretty big issue because on certain of the Hawaiian islands, especially the big island in Maui, they wanted to make sure that they were capturing the revenue from rental car from people who were coming and driving on their roads. Okay, so a pilot would show drivers how a mileage-based user fee would actually work in reality, not just, me giving examples here. It would talk about different MBUF collection mechanisms, and I do think it's helpful to give folks a bunch of different mechanisms. I talked about sort of the high-tech GPS method, but there's also several lower-tech methods, be it a simple odometer reading, be it a device that does not have any monitoring of location. And I think for folks that are concerned about privacy, it's important to offer choice. It's important to give folks those options. A pilot would examine the rural-urban split, some of the privacy issues I mentioned, the fuel tax refunding, the need for all vehicles, the multi-state travel or cross-state travel, I mentioned that. I know it's a little less of a problem here in Michigan than maybe in some of the East Coast states, but obviously there's some travel into Indiana, into Ohio, into Wisconsin, and looking at that and seeing how that works is important. And then if the pilot is successful, how to transition to a permanent program. So the question is, who should be interested in a state pilot? And so I like to say I have my 4 people in various states of either despair or joy here. If you think that this is a great idea and everything that I've told you, it's been fantastic and you love this idea, you should want to do a pilot because it's a good idea and it will prove that it's a good idea. On the other hand, if you think that this is a terrible idea, and who on earth would come up with such a ridiculous notion, you should want to do a pilot because it will show it's a bad idea and move on to something else. I do want to speak briefly on Michigan's what I call bus mobility wallet pilot, which is a current pilot that's undergoing. The state is currently doing a representative statewide survey. Some of you may have participated in it to judge public rocker mileage-based user fee knowledge and acceptance. And I know last week the department said that they had a total of 19,000 validated responses as of late February. I think there's some useful information there because it asks people about transportation methods and do you know how transportation's funded, how much do you pay, you get to watch a nice little video, provide some information. I will say the second step of that pilot is the mobility wallet simulation, which is really designed around transit in Detroit and Grand Rapids, which is an interesting concept, but not really what we're talking about here. So it's sort of a cousin, but not something that we're looking at. And so I think it's very important to do a full pilot that looks at areas across the state and looks at transportation funding more as a whole, as opposed to just some transit uses. But I will say some of the public opinion data in that survey could be quite helpful and could sort of help not reinvent the wheel. So the last part of my presentation is going to talk a little bit about the comprehensive pilot details. And so in my view, just estimation, an approximate total cost for a comprehensive pilot would be between about $4 and $5 million. And I think that would get a very representative sample that would touch all areas of the state, all demographic groups, all folks. I would recommend a technical advisory committee that helps guide the development. I will say other states have come up with different numbers. I chose 11 because that gives the opportunity for Michigan DOT, different highway users, privacy rights, rural representatives. I think it's important to have folks who maybe are concerned about this technology, be that somebody from the ACLU, somebody from the Michigan Trucking Association, just so they can get familiar with it and see. I think it's important to have availability of different methods, privacy protections, ease of collecting data, discuss some law enforcement access and security as well. And then determine the collection methods with the multiple options, as I mentioned before. I do think it's helpful to work with the private vendor. I think MDOT, I don't know if they tell you, but they're obviously busy with a lot of stuff. And so to the effect that there's someone out there, and there are several companies that have worked around the country to do this, I think that would make it a little bit better. Voluntary participation, absolutely. Refunds, absolutely. An analysis of the alternative means of collecting revenue and minimizing the personal information that's taken because that privacy is really important, and making sure that the data protection is in there as well. And then at the end, I would recommend submitting a report to this body as well as the governor, basically saying how it went. I could say all of those words down there, but it's basically, was it successful? What did you learn? What's the next step moving forward? How do we go ahead and do things? So let me go ahead and stop there. I will leave my contact information on the slide, and I am very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you for kind of flying through all that. I know it was a lot. I just want to point out to those listening is the sheer reality is that we have a revenue issue when it comes to funding our roads and our infrastructure. And, we've heard estimates, but I think everyone agrees it's multi-billions of dollars annually. I think most estimates now are between $3.5 and $4 billion. And from the data I've been presented, I don't think that there's any one solution that's going to kind of solve that deficit in itself. And so we're going to have to kind of continue to learn and research a myriad of options that are out there. And so, I do think there's a lot of benefits to a road use charge or vehicle miles traveled or whatever the cool kids are calling it these days. And so I appreciate your expertise in doing that. We do have a couple minutes for questions. I want to open up to colleagues, but please be direct in your questions. And then if for anything a little bit longer, please take that offline. Rep. Hood?
I nominate you for quote of the day. I mean, you've got like 3 submissions in this presentation. And second, I'm curious a little bit about size and scale and scope of a VMT pilot. How many road users would we need to see participate? Who would we be looking for? What kind of diversity in that population? Can you talk a little bit to that question?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for your first question. I would say in terms of target, I would aim for about 10,000 in the pilot. And I would say you want as diverse a population as you can get it. You really want the population to look like the state of Michigan. So, different demographic groups, low income and high income, different types of cars, certainly urban, rural, and suburban, certainly geographic areas of the state, Upper Peninsula, Metro Detroit, all of the cities, folks who live near the border, especially Ohio and Indiana, who might travel back and forth. I know there's some of that. You want to make it attractive to all of those folks. And some states have reached out, either through postcard mailings or calls or something to try to get as representative sample as possible. Some states have worked with, groups who do that, maybe have a little better knowledge of that. But yeah, you want a sample that's representative of the state as a whole.
Thank you.
Rep. Steele?
Just real quick, being that we're so short on money and time, is there any, can we look at other states' reports to, kind of what their outcome has been? So like what other states have you done? Is there something that we could look at to see how it turned out for, I don't know, Ohio or Indiana or Illinois around us to see? I guess I was just trying to save some time and money, so if it's even worthwhile. That's my question.
Sure. So absolutely, I will say Ohio is the one in the Midwest now that's working on it right now. So their report is not quite finished. I think Virginia has probably the best program, the largest program, and so they're worth looking at. Also, a state with some similar demographics. Oregon has some very good privacy protections, so I recommend that as well. There is value, I think, in having a pilot just in terms of familiarizing people in the state with it. But absolutely, looking at what other states have done is a great idea. Can you share that? Sure, absolutely.
Rep. Skaggs?
Thank you, Chair. As far as quote of the day goes, I think if the gas tax is an aging rock star, then it's goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I thought that was funny. Get it? The road? Okay. All right, I'll move on. So it seems like you mentioned just really quickly about some details about what some options are within this, and we actually have had some discussions about this already, that you could do something particularly high-tech that would sort of track and gain that knowledge of what roads you were driving on at what time, all the way down to a kind of like, okay, this is just your yearly odometer reading, and it's like, thanks for coming in. I know Virginia did that maybe like 25, 30 years ago. What states have done different things? I mean, if we're dealing with a privacy voluntary issue, I was just noodling around this idea that perhaps you just tell everyone, look, if you want to just pay the equivalent of 20,000 miles a year, then just do that. If you want to put in a GPS system that would look at your odometer, maybe make sure that you were at least within Michigan during that time, or some level of detail. Then you could do that. But it would be, a completely optional program, although everyone would pay. I could think of other things where you would just self-report, and then when the car needed to be sold, perhaps you could, the odometer would be looked at then. You wouldn't be able to sell the car. So I just wonder what different options are there within the overall framework of a vehicle miles traveled?
Sure. So there's a bunch of different options. I think you did a pretty good job of highlighting them. You have that high-tech GPS system. You have another, what I would say, lower tech system that records the miles, but not where and when you've traveled, and the odometer reading. And most states that have done a pilot have done some variation of those three options. And Virginia right now in their permanent program does in fact those three options, and they're looking at some others. They looked at actually a flat fee, and there were some challenges with that flat fee with variance in terms of some people driving more than others. But that's not to say it's not an interesting option. They've also looked at cell phones and whether they can do cell phones, and that would be a very low cost option. But there's issues with people cheating and making sure they have the cell phone, the rest of it. They also looked at having the car when you go to mechanic, and basically having the mechanic look at the car and verify the maintenance, or verify the mileage, excuse me, and then have a reporting at that point in time. So the three that they've settled on are the GPS system, the non-GPS in your car system, and the flat odometer reading. But I know they've looked at others, and I know other states are looking at others too.
Yep, thank you. Rep. Borden.
Thank you. This will be a quick one. It's actually just a statement. I was a little bit concerned when you characterized my constituents in rural Michigan as driving old cars and pickup trucks.
So, no, yes, no, didn't mean to generalize, just wanted to make sure I made the point that rural residents don't necessarily pay more.
I got you. That was tongue in cheek.
We are pressed on time. I have a quick question. The data that's being collected, is this the data that would need to be collected for a more robust VMT model? Is that something that OEMs already have on some of these newer vehicles that have a little bit more technology built into them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in all of the vehicles made in the past 3 years, the OEMs do have that data. It has been a challenging conversation to get them to share it.
Sure.
They are concerned that their drivers would not like it if they share it. But yes, it is technically doable.
Okay, I get that. All right, great. We went a little over. My apologies for some house. Thank you for your presentation. Your information is available in terms of if anyone does have any more questions for you. We'll continue this series of conversations. We're going to meet next week again, get the band back together for March 13th. Representative Steckloff moves to excuse absent members. Without objection, it is so ordered. With no further business, the committee will stand adjourned.